Welcome and settle in comfortably as we embark on a gentle journey through the ancient world of Greece, where the rhythms of daily life unfolded around one of humanity's most fundamental needs: food. Tonight we'll explore the hidden realities of what the ancient Greeks truly ate, how they prepared their meals, and the profound ways in which food shaped their society, their philosophy, and their very understanding of what it meant to be human. Imagine yourself drifting back through the centuries, past the familiar monuments and marble columns that populate our textbooks, beyond the grand narratives of gods and heroes, to discover the quieter, more intimate truths of ancient Greek life. Here, in the kitchens and marketplaces, around humble hearths and elaborate banquet tables, it unfolds a story that reveals as much about these remarkable people as any epic poem or philosophical treatise. The ancient Greeks, for all their contributions to Western civilization, lived lives that revolved around the constant, pressing reality of sustenance. Their relationship with food was far more complex and revealing than the simple olive and wine narrative we often encounter. Tonight we uncover the surprising struggles of those who built the great monuments, the austere dietary philosophies that shaped great minds, the sacred and social significance of everyday ingredients, and the stark contrasts between the tables of the wealthy and the bowls of the poor. Let yourself relax as we begin this exploration, allowing the gentle cadence of history to wash over you, carrying you deeper into a world where every meal told a story, every ingredient held meaning, and every shared table revealed the intricate web of ancient Greek society. The morning sun rises over the marble quarries of Mount Pentelicus, casting long shadows across the dusty work sites where hundreds of men begin another day of back-breaking labor. These are the workers who carved and hauled the stone that would become the Parthenon. Yet their own lives were marked by a constant struggle for adequate nourishment. That stands in stark contrast to the magnificent monuments they created. Imagine yourself among these laborers, your hands already rough from years of handling rope and stone, your body lean not from athletic training like the idealized sculptures you help create, but from the persistent gnawing of inadequate nutrition. The day begins before dawn, not with a hearty breakfast, but with whatever meager provisions you could afford or prepare the night before your euro, if any remained after feeding your family. For the typical Greek worker, breakfast was often nothing more than a piece of barley bread, perhaps softened with diluted wine or water if you were fortunate enough to have either. Barley, not wheat, formed the foundation of the working man's diet. While wheat was available, it commanded a price that placed it beyond the reach of most laborers. The barley bread they consumed was coarse, dense, and filling, designed more for sustenance than pleasure. It filled the stomach and provided energy for the grueling physical work ahead, but it lacked the nutrients necessary for optimal health. The bread itself tells a story of class distinction that permeated every aspect of Greek society. The finest white bread, made from sifted wheat flour, graced the tables of the wealthy, while workers subsisted on dark, heavy loaves that often contained bran, and sometimes even less appetizing additions when grain was scarce. During times of particular hardship, acorns might be ground into the flour, creating a bitter, astringent taste that lingered long after the meal was finished. Water, that most basic of human needs, presented its own challenges for the working classes. Clean, fresh water was not always readily available, particularly on construction sites or in the quarries. Workers often relied on communal wells or streams that might be contaminated by the very work they were performing. The marble dust that coated everything: their skin, their clothes, their food, inevitably found its way into their drinking water, creating a gritty, mineral taste that became as familiar as their own voices. As the morning progressed and the Mediterranean sun climbed higher, the physical demands of their labor intensified. Moving massive blocks of marble required teams of men working in perfect coordination, their muscles straining against ropes and levers, their feet finding purchase on rocky, uneven ground. The energy demands were enormous, yet their midday meal, if they were fortunate enough to have one, consisted of little more than olives. Perhaps a small piece of cheese if they could afford it, and more of that same coarse barley bread. The olives that sustained them were often the small bitter varieties that grew wild or were cultivated on marginal land. These were not the plump, oil-rich olives that would grace a wealthy citizen's table, but rather the smaller, more intense fruits that provided essential fats in a diet otherwise dominated by grains. Workers would carry these olives in small pouches, eating them throughout the day to maintain their strength, the salt and oil providing crucial nutrients, even as the bitter taste reminded them of their station in life. Cheese, when available, came from goats rather than cows. Goat cheese was less expensive to produce and could be made in smaller quantities, making it more accessible to working families. The cheese was often quite strong, aged in conditions that were far from ideal, developing flavors that were intense and sometimes overwhelming. Yet it provided essential proteins and fats that their grain-heavy diet otherwise lacked. The rhythm of their working day was punctuated by brief moments of rest, during which they might share what little food they had brought with them. These communal meals, humble as they were, served a social function that went beyond mere nutrition. Men would gather in whatever shade they could find, sharing not just food but news, complaints, and the small jokes that made their difficult lives bearable. The act of breaking bread together, even when that bread was coarse and the portions small, created bonds of solidarity that helped them endure the physical and economic hardships of their existence. As afternoon wore on and the sun beat down mercilessly on the work sites, dehydration became a constant concern. The workers' bodies, already depleted by inadequate nutrition, struggled to maintain the fluid balance necessary for sustained physical labor. Sweat poured from their bodies, carrying with it essential salts and minerals that their limited diet could barely replace. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as chronic dehydration, their performance diminishing as the day progressed, their bodies operating on reserves that were never fully replenished. The evening brought relief from the physical demands of labor, but not from the concerns about food. Workers would trudge home to modest dwellings where their wives and children waited, often having eaten little during the day in order to preserve what food remained for the primary breadwinner. The evening meal, the most substantial of the day, still consisted primarily of barley, porridge, or bread, supplemented by whatever vegetables could be grown in small household gardens or gathered from the wild. These vegetables were often simple fare: onions, leeks, cabbage, and lentils when they could be afforded. Meat was a rare luxury, appearing perhaps once a month, or during religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed and the meat distributed among the community. When meat did appear on a worker's table, it was usually in small quantities, often preserved with salt or dried to extend its usefulness, and incorporated into stews or porridges that could stretch the precious protein across multiple meals. The cooking methods available to working families were necessarily simple. Most had access to only basic clay pots and a simple hearth, if they were fortunate. Many lived in quarters where cooking facilities were shared or extremely limited, forcing them to rely on foods that required minimal preparation. Barley could be boiled into porridge. Olives needed no cooking at all. Vegetables could be eaten raw or quickly boiled in whatever vessel was available. Sleep came early for these workers, not from contentment but from exhaustion. Their bodies, depleted by physical labor and inadequately nourished by their limited diet, demanded rest as much for recovery as for the simple escape from hunger that sleep provided. Many went to bed with the same gnawing emptiness in their stomachs that had accompanied them throughout the day, their bodies slowly consuming their own muscle mass to fuel the demanding physical work that awaited them with each sunrise. The seasonal nature of construction work added another layer of uncertainty to their already precarious food situation. During winter months, when outdoor work was impossible or severely limited, these men faced extended periods of unemployment with no steady income to purchase food. Many survived these lean months by working odd jobs, relying on the charity of family members, or simply enduring extended periods of semi-starvation that left them weakened and vulnerable to disease. The cumulative effect of this lifestyle, the combination of hard physical labor, inadequate nutrition, poor sanitation, and economic uncertainty, took a toll that was visible in their appearance and evident in their shortened lifespans. These were men whose bodies showed the wear of their circumstances, joints swollen from repetitive strain, skin weathered, and scarred from their work, teeth worn down from the gritty bread that formed their dietary staple, and a general leanness that spoke not of athletic conditioning, but of chronic undernourishment. Yet it was these very men, struggling daily for adequate food and basic comfort, who created some of the most beautiful and enduring monuments in human history. The marble they carved with such skill, despite their own physical hardships, would outlast them by millennia. The temples and statues they erected would be admired by countless generations, yet few would pause to consider the human cost of their creation, or the empty stomachs and calloused hands that shaped such beauty from raw stone. Their legacy lies not just in the monuments they built, but in the quiet dignity with which they endured lives of hardship, finding meaning in community even in circumstances that offered little comfort or security. These workers represent the vast majority of ancient Greek society people, whose names are lost to history, but whose labor and sacrifice made possible the golden age we still celebrate today. From the dusty construction sites and marble quarries, we now turn our attention to a very different corner of ancient Greek society, the quiet studies and public gathering places where philosophy was born and nurtured. Here, in the intellectual heart of Athens, we encounter men whose relationship with food was as carefully considered as their thoughts on justice, virtue, and the nature of existence itself. Imagine yourself walking through the agora on a warm morning around 430 BCE. The marketplace already bustling with vendors hawking their wares, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread, grilled fish, and ripening fruit. Among the crowds you might catch sight of a peculiar figure neither wealthy nor destitute in appearance, but carrying himself with a dignity that seems to transcend material concerns. This is Socrates, perhaps the most famous philosopher in history, and his approach to food reveals as much about his character as any of his recorded dialogues. Socrates, the son of a stonemason and a midwife, understood intimately the struggles of ordinary Athenians to secure adequate nutrition. Yet his relationship with food was fundamentally different from both the workers we've just encountered and the wealthy elites we'll meet later. For Socrates, food was neither a constant worry nor a source of pleasure, but rather a necessity to be managed with the same rational approach he applied to all aspects of life. The philosopher's typical day began before dawn, not with a meal, but with contemplation. While his fellow citizens were breaking their fast with bread and wine, Socrates would often stand motionless in thought, sometimes for hours, oblivious to the physical sensations of hunger that would drive other men to seek immediate satisfaction. When he finally did eat, it was with a deliberate simplicity that reflected his philosophical principles. His breakfast, when he remembered to eat it at all, consisted of the most basic fare: a small piece of barley bread, perhaps a few olives, and water drawn from a public fountain. There was no wine to soften the bread, no honey to sweeten it, no cheese to provide richness. The meal was purely functional fuel for a body that he viewed as merely the vessel for his soul and mind. Yet in this simplicity lay a profound statement about the relationship between physical and spiritual nourishment. Socrates believed that excessive attention to bodily pleasures, including the enjoyment of food, distracted the soul from its pursuit of wisdom and virtue. This was not mere asceticism for its own sake, but a carefully reasoned approach to living that prioritized the development of character over the satisfaction of appetite. He would often go entire days eating nothing more than a handful of olives and a crust of bread. Not from poverty, though, he was certainly not wealthy, but from a genuine indifference to culinary pleasure. The midday hours found Socrates in the agora or the gymnasiums, engaging in the conversations that would make him famous. As he questioned merchants, politicians, and fellow citizens about the nature of justice, courage, and wisdom, food vendors would pass by offering their wares: grilled sausages fragrant with herbs, fresh fish still glistening from the morning catch, honeyed pastries that drew crowds of eager buyers. Socrates would typically ignore these temptations entirely, his attention focused completely on the intellectual feast before him. When invited to symposiums, the elaborate dinner parties that were central to aristocratic, Athenian social life, Socrates presented a fascinating contrast to his fellow guests. While others reclined on couches, sampling delicacies and drinking wine mixed with water in carefully calculated proportions, Socrates would eat sparingly and drink even less. His companions often marveled at his ability to consume large quantities of wine without apparent effect, not realizing that his apparent immunity came not from a strong constitution, but from his habit of eating very little, which actually made him more susceptible to alcohol's effects, while his philosophical discipline allowed him to maintain mental clarity regardless. The philosopher's evening meal, when he bothered with one, was typically shared with his wife Xanthippe and their children in their modest home. These meals were simple affairs, a porridge made from barley or sometimes wheat if the family's finances permitted, seasoned with olive oil and salt, perhaps accompanied by onions or leeks from their small garden. Xanthippe, practical and concerned with household management in a way that Socrates never was, would occasionally express frustration with her husband's indifference to the quality and quantity of their food. The children, still growing and naturally hungry, would sometimes eye their father, untouched portion, with longing, knowing that he would often push his bowl toward them with a gentle smile. More interested in discussing the day's philosophical insights than in consuming his share of the evening's modest meal. This generosity was not born of calculated kindness, but from a genuine lack of interest in food that sometimes troubled his family even as it exemplified his philosophical principles. Socrates' approach to fasting was particularly revealing of his character. While religious festivals often called for periods of abstinence, and while some philosophical schools practiced fasting as a form of spiritual discipline, Socrates' relationship with hunger was more complex. He would sometimes fast not from religious conviction or philosophical exercise, but simply because he had become so absorbed in thought that he forgot to eat. These unintentional fasts could last for days, with the philosopher emerging from his contemplative states, appearing slightly bewildered by his body's protests. During times of particular hardship in Athens, sieges, famines, or economic difficulties, Socrates' eating habits changed very little, which was both a blessing and a source of concern for those who cared about him. While his neighbors might be desperately seeking additional food sources or rationing their meager supplies, Socrates continued his pattern of minimal consumption, seemingly unaware of the crisis around him. His natural asceticism served him well during these difficult periods, as he required little more than he typically consumed. Yet his friends worried about his health and his family's welfare. The philosopher's relationship with wine deserves particular attention, as it reveals much about his approach to pleasure and self-control at symposiums. While other guests would carefully mix their wine with water in ratios designed to maintain sociability without losing intellectual acuity, Socrates would often drink his wine unmixed, a practice considered somewhat barbaric by refined Athenians. Yet he never appeared intoxicated, leading to speculation about his constitution and habits that missed the deeper point. Socrates had achieved a level of self-mastery that allowed him to remain true to his principles, regardless of external circumstances. His students and followers often attempted to emulate his dietary habits, with varying degrees of success. Some, misunderstanding the philosopher's motivations, turned his natural indifference to food into a rigid asceticism that bordered on self-punishment. Others, recognizing that Socrates' approach was deeply personal and tied to his individual constitution and calling, adopted modified versions of his practices while maintaining their own relationships with food and pleasure. The contrast between Socrates' eating habits and those of other philosophers of his era illuminates the diversity of approaches to the relationship between body and mind in ancient Greek thought. While Socrates viewed food as a necessary but unimportant aspect of existence, other thinkers developed more complex relationships with cuisine and its role in the philosophical life. As Socrates aged, his eating habits remained remarkably consistent, even as his body began to show the effects of a lifetime of minimal attention to nutrition. He became increasingly thin, his skin taking on the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, engaged in conversation with whoever would listen. Yet his mental acuity remained sharp, suggesting that his approach to food, whatever its physical costs, had not impaired his intellectual capacity. The final meal of Socrates' life has become legendary, not for its content but for the circumstances surrounding it. On the day of his execution, after being condemned to death for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety toward the gods, Socrates was offered the opportunity to eat a final meal of his choosing. True to his character, he requested nothing elaborate, simply asking for whatever was available, expressing gratitude for the food, while remaining focused on the philosophical discussions he continued to have with his friends and students until the very end. When the time came to drink the hemlock that would end his life, Socrates approached even this final consumption with the same rational calm he had brought to every meal throughout his existence. He examined the cup as he might have examined a simple bowl of porridge, with neither fear nor anticipation, but with the detached curiosity that had characterized his approach to all physical experiences. The legacy of Socrates' relationship with food extends far beyond his personal habits. His approach influenced generations of philosophers who grappled with questions about the proper relationship between physical and intellectual pursuits, between bodily pleasures and spiritual development. Some embraced his ascetic tendencies, while others argued for a more balanced approach that honored both physical and mental well-being. In the broader context of ancient Greek society, Socrates' eating habits represented one extreme of a spectrum that ranged from the desperate hunger of the working poor to the elaborate feasts of the wealthy elite. His voluntary simplicity stood as a challenge to both extremes, a reminder that human dignity and intellectual achievement need not depend on either the satisfaction of all desires or the complete denial of physical needs. The philosopher's approach to food also reflected broader Greek values about self-control, rational thought, and the pursuit of virtue. In a society that often celebrated moderation as a cardinal virtue, Socrates embodied this principle in his eating habits, though he took it to a degree that many of his contemporaries found extreme or even troubling. Stepping away from the individual experiences of workers and philosophers, we now turn our attention to the broader tapestry of ancient Greek cuisine, the ingredients, preparation methods, and cultural significance of food that shaped an entire civilization. Imagine yourself walking through the countryside of ancient Attica, where the Mediterranean sun bathes rolling hills dotted with olive groves and vineyards, where the very landscape tells the story of a people who learned to coax sustenance and pleasure from rocky soil and variable climate. The foundation of ancient Greek cuisine rested upon what the Greeks themselves called the Mediterranean triad: wheat, olives, and grapes. Three crops that not only provided sustenance, but became deeply embedded in their religious beliefs, social customs, and cultural identity. These were the gifts of Demeter, Athena, and Dionysus, respectively. Divine offerings that transformed the challenging terrain of the Greek peninsula into a homeland capable of supporting one of history's most influential civilizations. Wheat, when it could be grown successfully, represented the pinnacle of grain cultivation in ancient Greece. The Greeks distinguished carefully between different types of wheat, with the finest varieties reserved for the most important occasions. Bread made from these premium wheats was light, white, and relatively soft, a luxury that marked social status as clearly as any piece of jewelry or fine clothing. The process of creating this bread was labor-intensive and required considerable skill. From the careful selection and cleaning of grain to the precise fermentation and baking that produced the desired texture and flavor. Yet for most Greeks, barley remained the more practical and affordable grain. Barley grew more reliably in the variable climate and poor soils that characterized much of the Greek landscape, producing larger yields with less risk of crop failure. The bread made from barley was darker, denser, and more filling than wheat bread, with a distinctly nutty flavor that became as familiar to most Greeks as their own names. This barley bread could be eaten fresh, but it was also commonly prepared as a thick porridge called maza, which could be flavored with honey, olive oil, cheese, or whatever other ingredients were available. The olive trees that dotted the Greek landscape were more than just sources of foods. they were symbols of civilization itself, presenting the transformation of wild land into productive agricultural space. These ancient trees, some living for centuries, required years to mature and produce fruit, making them investments in the future that connected generations of families to the same plots of land. The olives they produced varied enormously in size, flavor, and oil content, with different varieties harvested at different times of year to produce distinct culinary experiences. Fresh olives, picked when still green and firm, were typically cured in brine solutions that drew out their natural bitterness, while preserving them for extended periods. The curing process itself was an art form, with families passing down recipes and techniques through generations. Some olives were packed with herbs, wild thyme, oregano, or bay leaves that grew abundantly in the Greek countryside, creating flavor combinations that were both practical and sophisticated. The oil pressed from ripe olives served multiple functions in Greek society, from cooking and food preservation to lighting and religious rituals. The best olive oil, cold pressed from the first harvest of fully ripe olives, was golden green in color with a rich fruity flavor that enhanced virtually any food it touched. Its premium oil was often reserved for special occasions or religious ceremonies, while lower grades were used for everyday cooking and food preparation. Grapes and the wine they produced held a special place in Greek culture that went far beyond simple nutrition. The cultivation of grapes required intimate knowledge of local conditions, soil types, drainage patterns, sun exposure, and microclimates that could vary dramatically, even within small areas. Greek winemakers developed sophisticated techniques for maximizing both the quantity and quality of their harvests. Understanding that wine was not just a beverage, but a crucial element of social and religious life, the process of winemaking began with the careful selection of grapes at optimal ripeness, when sugar content was high, but acidity remained balanced. The grapes were crushed by foot in large stone basins, a process that required skill to extract juice without breaking the bitter seeds that could spoil the wine's flavor. The resulting must was then fermented in large clay vessels called pitho, which were often buried in the ground to maintain consistent temperatures during the critical fermentation period. Greek wines varied enormously in character, from light, fresh wines meant to be consumed within months of production to rich, concentrated wines that could age for years. Many wines were flavored with herbs, spices, or tree resins, creating complex flavor profiles that were quite different from modern wine styles. Pine resin, in particular, was commonly added to wine both for its preservative properties and for the distinctive flavor. It imparted a taste that connected drinkers to the forested mountains where the resin was collected. The consumption of wine in ancient Greece was governed by elaborate social conventions that reflected deep-seated beliefs about the proper relationship between civilization and wildness, between rational thought and emotional expression. Wine was almost never consumed undiluted. To do so was considered barbaric and dangerous. Instead, it was mixed with water in carefully calculated proportions, typically ranging from 1 part wine to 2 parts water for everyday consumption, 2 equal parts for more festive occasions. Beyond the basic triad of wheat, olives, and grapes, ancient Greek cuisine incorporated a remarkable variety of other ingredients drawn from both cultivated fields and wild landscapes. Legumes played a crucial role in the Greek diet, providing essential proteins that were often scarce and expensive to obtain from animal sources. Lentils, chickpeas, black-eyed peas, and various types of beans were grown throughout the Greek world. their cultivation carefully timed to take advantage of seasonal rains and to complement the growing cycles of grain crops. These legumes were prepared in numerous ways, from simple boiled preparations seasoned with olive oil and salt to complex stews that incorporated vegetables, herbs, and small amounts of meat or fish when available. The cooking liquid from boiled legumes was often saved and consumed as a nutritious broth, ensuring that no valuable nutrients were wasted. During times of scarcity, legume-based dishes became the primary source of sustenance for many families. Their high protein content helping to sustain energy and health when other foods were unavailable. Vegetables formed another crucial component of the ancient Greek diet, though the varieties available were quite different from those we might expect today. Onions and garlic were fundamental flavoring agents, their pungent qualities helping to make simple grain and legume dishes more palatable and satisfying. Leeks, cabbage, and various types of greens were cultivated in household gardens, while wild greens were collected from fields and mountainsides according to seasonal availability. The Greeks developed sophisticated knowledge of wild edible plants, understanding which leaves, roots, and seeds could provide nutrition and flavor throughout the year. Dandelion greens, wild asparagus, purslane, and numerous other plants were gathered by those who knew where and when to find them. This foraging knowledge was particularly important for rural families and during times of economic hardship, when cultivated foods might be scarce or too expensive. Fish and seafood provided essential protein for coastal communities, though the methods of preservation and distribution meant that fresh fish was a luxury even for those living near the sea. Small fish like sardines and anchovies were commonly preserved in salt, creating intensely flavored ingredients that could add depth and complexity to simple grain-based dishes. Larger fish were often grilled or roasted for immediate consumption, their flesh seasoned with wild herbs and drizzled with precious olive oil. The preparation and consumption of meat in ancient Greece was closely tied to religious practices and social occasions. Most meat consumption occurred during religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed to the gods and their flesh distributed among the community participants. These sacrificial meals were significant social events that reinforced community bonds, while providing rare opportunities for most people to consume substantial amounts of protein. The animals typically used for these sacrifices, goats, sheep, cattle, were raised primarily for their secondary products rather than their meat. Goats provided milk for cheese making and hair for textiles. Sheep produced wool as well as milk. And cattle were valued for their labor in farming operations. The sacrifice of these valuable animals thus represented a significant economic investment in religious and social cohesion. Dairy products, primarily cheese made from goat and sheep milk, provided another important source of protein and fat in the Greek diet. The cheese-making process was well developed, producing varieties that ranged from fresh, soft cheeses consumed within days of production to hard-aged cheeses that could be stored for months. The aging process often took place in caves or other cool, humid environments that provided the consistent conditions necessary for proper fermentation and flavor development. Honey served as the primary sweetening agent in ancient Greek cuisine, as sugar was unknown and fruit-based sweeteners were limited by seasonal availability and preservation challenges. The Greeks developed sophisticated beekeeping techniques, understanding the habits and needs of honeybees well enough to maintain productive hives in various. The honey they produced varied in flavor depending on the flowers visited by the bees. creating subtle taste differences that experienced consumers could identify and appreciate. The collection of wild honey from natural hives was also practiced, though this was a dangerous activity that required considerable skill and knowledge. Wild honey was often considered superior to domestic honey, possessing more complex flavors derived from the diverse wildflowers and herbs that grew in untamed landscapes. Herbs and spices played crucial roles in ancient Greek cooking, both for their flavoring properties and for their believed medicinal benefits. The Mediterranean climate supported the growth of numerous aromatic plants: oregano, thyme, mint, parsley, and many others that grew wild or could be easily cultivated in small gardens. These herbs were used fresh when available, but they were also carefully dried and preserved for use during seasons when fresh herbs were scarce. The use of herbs in Greek cooking was not merely a matter of taste preference, but reflected deeper beliefs about the relationship between food and health. Many herbs were believed to possess specific medicinal properties, and their inclusion in meals was seen as a way of maintaining health and preventing disease. This holistic approach to food and medicine meant that meal preparation was both a practical activity and a form of preventive health care. Salt, essential for food preservation and flavor enhancement, was obtained through various methods depending on geographic location. Coastal communities could produce salt through the evaporation of seawater in shallow pans, while inland areas relied on rock salt deposits or trade with coastal regions. The quality of salt varied considerably, with the finest varieties being highly prized for their pure flavor and effective preservation properties. The seasonal nature of food production meant that ancient Greeks developed sophisticated preservation techniques to ensure year-round nutrition. Olives were cured and stored in oil or brine, grapes were dried into raisins or fermented into wine, and various vegetables were pickled or dried for extended storage. Fish were salted, smoked, or preserved in oil, while meat from sacrificial animals was often dried or cured to extend its usefulness beyond the immediate feast. These preservation methods were not merely practical necessities, but contributed to the development of complex flavors that became integral to Greek cuisine. The intense, concentrated tastes of preserved foods, salty olives, tangy pickled vegetables, rich aged cheeses, created a flavor palette that was both sophisticated and practical, turning necessity into culinary artistry. As our journey through ancient Greek food culture draws toward its close, we turn our attention to perhaps the most revealing aspect of their society: the stark contrast between how the wealthy and the poor experienced food and what these differences tell us about power culture and human nature in the ancient world. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold between two worlds. On one side, the modest dwelling of a common citizen preparing their evening meal, and on the other, the elaborate dining hall of an aristocratic household preparing for a symposium that will last well into the night. The evening meal in a typical Greek household was a study in careful resource management and practical necessity. Picture the common citizen's wife, perhaps named Euphrosyne, as she prepares the family's main meal in the fading light of day. Her kitchen, if it can be called that, consists of a simple hearth built into one wall of their modest dwelling. A few clay pots of varying sizes, some wooden utensils worn smooth by years of use, and a small collection of bowls and cups that represent much of the family's material wealth. The meal she prepares follows patterns established by generations of women in similar circumstances. The foundation is barley, either ground into flour for bread or cooked, into a thick porridge that will fill hungry stomachs and provide energy for the next day's labor. She adds water carefully clean. Water is precious and must be used judiciously. The pot sits over a fire fed with carefully hoarded wood or charcoal, each piece of fuel representing a small expense that must be weighed against the family's other needs. To this basic foundation, Euphrosyne adds whatever other ingredients the family can afford. Perhaps a handful of lentils, soaked since morning to soften them for cooking. A few olives, their salt and oil providing essential nutrients, and a burst of flavor that transforms the bland porridge into something more satisfying. An onion, if the family has been fortunate enough to afford one, chopped and stirred into the mixture to add depth and complexity to the simple meal. The cooking process itself is slow and contemplative, requiring constant attention to prevent burning while allowing the flavors to meld together. Euphrosyne stirs the pot methodically, her movements economical, and practiced her mind. Occupied with calculations about tomorrow's meals, the children's needs, her husband, his work, and the countless small concerns that fill the days of those who must carefully manage limited resources. The family gathers around a simple wooden table as darkness falls, their meal illuminated by a single oil lamp that casts dancing shadows on the walls. The father, still bearing the dust and fatigue of his day's labor, offers a brief prayer of gratitude to the household gods before they begin to eat. The children, hungry from their own day's activities, consume their portions quickly, scraping their bowls clean with pieces of bread, leaving nothing to waste. The conversation around this humble table is quiet but warm, focused on the immediate concerns of daily life. Work completed and planned neighbors' news, the health of relatives, the small joys and worries that make up the texture of ordinary existence. The meal itself, while simple, serves its purpose of bringing the family together, providing necessary nutrition, and creating a moment of peace in lives that offer few opportunities for relaxation or leisure. Now, imagine crossing the city to enter a very different world, the symposium hall of a wealthy Athenian aristocrat named Callicrates. Here, in a room designed specifically for entertaining, couches upholstered with fine fabrics are arranged in a precise pattern around low tables inlaid with ivory and precious metals. The walls are decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from mythology and history, while bronze braziers provide warmth and light supplemented by numerous oil lamps, burning the finest quality oil, filling the air with a gentle, steady illumination that flatters the assembled guests. The preparation for this evening's symposium began days earlier, with Callicrates' household staff planning a menu designed not merely to satisfy hunger, but to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and cultural refinement. The kitchen, unlike Euphrosyne's simple hearth, is a complex operation involving multiple rooms, specialized equipment, and a staff of trained cooks, each with specific responsibilities and areas of expertise. The meal begins with a selection of appetizers that would represent several days' income for a working family. Olives, but not the small, bitter varieties that sustain the poor. These are large, perfectly cured specimens imported from distant regions, each one selected for its size, flavor, and visual appeal. They are arranged artfully on silver platters, alongside various types of cheese, some aged in caves for months to develop complex flavors, others fresh and creamy, made from the milk of specially tended goats and sheep. Fresh fish, transported from the coast in containers of seawater to maintain their quality. are prepared using techniques that require considerable skill and experience. Some are grilled over carefully selected wood that imparts subtle flavors. Others are prepared in complex sauces made from wine, honey, herbs, and spices that have been traded from distant lands. The presentation of these dishes is as important as their taste, with each plate arranged to please the eye as well as the palate. The bread served at this aristocratic table tells its own story of privilege and exclusion. Made from the finest wheat flour sifted multiple times to remove any trace of bran or impurities, it is white soft, and light a direct contrast to the dense, dark barley bread that forms the staple of common citizens' diets. This bread is baked fresh for each meal, its crust golden and crisp, its interior tender and aromatic with the scent of perfectly fermented dough. Wine flows freely at the symposium, but its consumption follows elaborate rituals that demonstrate the host's cultural sophistication and social status. The wines themselves are carefully selected from the household cellar, which contains amphorae from various regions, each with its own characteristics and reputation. Some wines are aged for years, developing complex flavors that can only be achieved through patience and proper storage. Others are young and fresh, chosen for their bright acidity and fruit flavors that complement specific dishes. The mixing of wine with water becomes a ceremonial act, with precise ratios calculated to maintain the proper balance between conviviality and intellectual discourse. Silver mixing bowls, decorated with intricate designs, are used to blend the wine and water, with servants trained in the proper techniques ensuring that each guest receives wine of the exact strength appropriate to the evening's planned activities. The symposium itself represents a form of entertainment unknown to common citizens, combining fine dining with intellectual discourse, political discussion, and cultural performance. Professional entertainers, musicians, dancers, and storytellers provide amusement between courses. Their performance is carefully choreographed to enhance the evening's themes and maintain the proper atmosphere of refined leisure. The guests themselves, drawn from the highest levels of Athenian society, engage in conversations that range from philosophy and politics to poetry and art. These discussions, fueled by fine wine and elaborate food, often continue late into the night, exploring ideas and forging relationships that will influence the city's political and cultural direction. The variability to participate in such extended leisure activities marks these men as fundamentally different from the workers and craftsmen whose labor makes their lifestyle possible. The contrast between these two meals, one born of necessity and careful resource management, the other of abundance and cultural display, reveals profound truths about ancient Greek society. The common family's evening meal, while humble, serves essential functions that go beyond mere nutrition. It brings the family together, reinforces social bonds, provides a moment of stability and comfort in lives marked by uncertainty and hard work. The aristocratic symposium, while certainly providing nutrition, serves different purposes entirely. It demonstrates social status, creates and maintains political alliances, provides a venue for cultural and intellectual exchange, and reinforces the hierarchical structure of society. The elaborate foods and wines are not chosen primarily for their nutritional value, but for their ability to communicate messages about wealth, sophistication, and social position. Yet both meals, in their own ways, reflect fundamental human needs that transcend social class. The desire for community, for shared experience, for moments of pleasure and connection, appears in both settings. though expressed through very different means. The common family finds satisfaction in simple foods shared with love and gratitude, while the aristocrats seek fulfillment through elaborate displays of wealth and culture. The servants who prepare and serve the aristocratic feast occupy an interesting position between these two worlds. Many come from backgrounds similar to our common family, yet their daily work involves handling ingredients and witnessing consumption patterns that are far removed from their own experiences. They possess intimate knowledge of luxury foods and elaborate preparation techniques, yet return each night to their own modest quarters where they eat simple meals similar to those we observed in the common household. The seasonal variations in food availability affect both social classes, though in different ways. When harvests fail or trade routes are disrupted, common families face genuine hardship, their already limited diets becoming even more restricted. Aristocratic households, while they may need to adjust their menus or pay higher prices for preferred ingredients, rarely face actual hunger or malnutrition. Their wealth provides a buffer that protects them from the worst effects of food scarcity. Religious festivals and public celebrations provide rare opportunities for common citizens to experience foods normally reserved for the wealthy. During major religious observances, when animals are sacrificed and their meat distributed among the community, ordinary families can taste roasted lamb or beef, sample varieties of wine usually beyond their reach, and participate in communal feasts that temporarily blur the normal social boundaries around food consumption. These festival meals serve important social functions, providing not only nutrition, but also a sense of community participation and shared cultural identity. They offer common citizens a glimpse into the world of abundance, normally reserved for the elite, while also reinforcing the social structures that maintain these distinctions during ordinary times. The health implications of these different dietary patterns were significant and visible in the ancient world. Common citizens, while often struggling with inadequate nutrition, typically maintained lean, muscular physiques due to their physically demanding lifestyles and simple diets. Their health problems were more likely to stem from malnutrition, exposure to harsh working conditions, and lack of medical care than from dietary excess. The wealthy, with access to abundant food and wine, face different health challenges. Overconsumption of rich foods and alcohol could lead to conditions that we would now recognize as related to metabolic disorders, while their sedentary lifestyles often resulted in poor physical conditioning despite their superior nutrition. The ancient Greek ideal of physical fitness and moderation was perhaps a response to the recognition that both poverty and excess could undermine human health and happiness. The recipes and cooking techniques used in aristocratic kitchens were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of skilled cooks and reflecting centuries of culinary evolution. These professional cooks possessed knowledge that went far beyond the simple preparation methods used in common. Households understanding how to combine ingredients in ways that created complex flavors and textures, how to preserve foods for extended periods, and how to present dishes in visually appealing ways. The contrast between elite and common food experiences in ancient Greece reveals fundamental truths about human society that extend far beyond the ancient world. Food serves not only as sustenance but as a marker of social identity, means of political expression, and a vehicle for cultural transmission. The inequalities we observe in ancient Greek dining reflect broader patterns of social organization that have persisted throughout human history, while also illuminating the universal human desires for community, pleasure, and meaningful shared experiences that transcend social boundaries. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Greek food culture, we are reminded that the choices people make about what to eat, how to prepare it, and with whom to share it reveal deep truths about their values, their social structures, and their understanding of what makes life meaningful. Whether gathered around a simple wooden table, sharing barley porridge, or reclining on silk cushions, sampling exotic delicacies, the ancient Greeks were engaging in fundamentally human activities that connect them across the centuries to our own experiences and struggles. As our journey through the culinary landscape of ancient Greece draws to a close, allow yourself to drift gently back through the centuries, carrying with you the tastes, aromas, and stories we have explored together. From the marble quarries, where workers sustain themselves on coarse barley bread and bitter olives, to the philosophical discussions where Socrates demonstrated that wisdom need not depend on elaborate cuisine, to the markets and kitchens where ordinary ingredients were transformed into the foundation of civilization, to the stark contrasts between humble family meals and elaborate aristocratic feasts. We have witnessed how food shaped and reflected every aspect of ancient Greek society. The ancient Greeks, for all their achievements in art, philosophy, and governance, lived lives fundamentally centered around the same basic human needs that occupy us today. They rose each morning with hunger to satisfy, spent their days working to secure their next meal, and gathered in the evening to share food with those they loved. Yet in these simple, universal activities, it created patterns of meaning and beauty that would influence human culture for millennia to come. The worker breaking his fast on barley bread before climbing the scaffolding of the Parthenon. The philosopher contemplating the nature of virtue while ignoring the honey cakes offered by passing vendors. The housewife carefully measuring precious olive oil into her family's evening porridge. The aristocrat selecting wines for his symposium. Each was participating in the fundamental human activity of transforming raw ingredients into sustenance, comfort, and meaning. What emerges from our exploration is not simply a catalog of ancient foods and cooking methods, but a deeper understanding of how human beings have always used food to express their values, maintain their relationships, and create order in an uncertain world. The careful rationing of grain in a poor household and the elaborate presentation of delicacies at a wealthy banquet both represent attempts to create dignity, beauty, and meaning through the essential act of eating. The rhythms of ancient Greek food culture, the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest, the daily routines of market visits and meal preparation, the social rituals of shared dining and religious feasting created a framework for understanding time, community, and identity that gave structure to individual lives and coherence to society as a whole. These patterns, developed over centuries of adaptation to the Mediterranean landscape and refined through countless generations of human experience. The family dinner, the business lunch, the holiday feast all echo the fundamental human understanding that eating together, the olive trees that still dot the Greek landscape, some of them descendants of trees that fed the workers and philosophers we have encountered tonight, continue to produce fruit that connects the present to the ancient past. The techniques for curing olives, pressing oil, and fermenting wine, refined over thousands of years, remind us that human knowledge and culture are preserved not only in books and monuments, but in the simple, repeated acts of daily life. The contrast between abundance and scarcity that marked ancient Greek society persists indifferent. forms today, yet the underlying human response is the careful management of limited resources. The use of food to express hospitality and care, the creation of beauty and meaning through shared meals remain constant across time and culture. In the quiet of this moment, as you allow these images and stories to settle in your mind, you might find comfort in the continuity of human experience across the centuries. The concerns that occupied the ancient Greeks, how to feed their families, how to find meaning in daily work, how to balance physical needs with spiritual aspirations, how to create community in the face of social divisions, are concerns that remain relevant today. The workers who built the Acropolis, despite their struggles with hunger and hardship, created beauty that has outlasted empires. The philosophers who contemplated the nature of virtue, while subsisting on the simplest fare, developed ideas that continue to influence human thought. The families who gathered around humble tables to share barley porridge and conversation created bonds of love and loyalty that gave meaning to their lives regardless of their material circumstances. But these stories remind you that human dignity does not depend on material abundance, that wisdom can flourish in the simplest circumstances, and that the most profound satisfactions often come not from what we consume, but from how we share what we have with others. The ancient Greeks understood that food was never merely about nutrition, it was about relationships, values, and the ongoing human project of creating meaning in a challenging world. As sleep approaches, carry with you the gentle reminder that you are part of this long human story, connected across time to countless generations who have faced similar challenges, found similar comforts, and discovered similar truths about what makes life worth living. The simple meal you ate today, the clean water you drank, the moment of gratitude you felt, all connect you to the worker breaking his fast before climbing the marble scaffolding, to the philosopher contemplating virtue over a cup of diluted wine, to the family gathering around their simple table as darkness fell over ancient Athens. Rest now in the knowledge that human beings have always found ways to create beauty, meaning, and connection through the essential act of sharing food, and that this ancient wisdom continues to nourish us today. Just as the olive trees planted by ancient hands continue to bear fruit under the same Mediterranean sun that warmed the stones of the Parthenon and illuminated the faces of those long-ago families as they gathered for their evening meal. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this continuing story, and that tomorrow's meals, like those of the ancient Greeks, will offer new opportunities to create nourishment, community, and meaning in your own life and in the lives of those around you.